Chapter 10. A new civilization emerges in Western Europe. Sometimes an individual life displays the complexities of a larger society. Godric, ultimately Saint Godric, was a 12th century Englishman, figure 10.1. His father was an ordinary farmer, but he early developed greater ambition. Godric started as a peddler, and according to his biographer, quickly learned how to turn a profit on cheap items. He was physically strong and a hard worker, necessary qualities for a life of trade and travel. He soon turned to urban commerce, which was beginning to increase rapidly during the 1100s. He participated in sea-going trade and with other parts of Britain and with the European continent, and clearly made a good living, acquiring a number of ships. He was not entirely at peace with himself. His biographer, a clergyman, spelled Clergyman, named Reginald of Durham, is eager to emphasize Godric's consistent Christianity. So he portrays him as content with a simple life even amid his riches, and quickly attracted to the saints and a life of God. He argues that Godric's sea voyages, undoubtedly risky, helped the future saint realize the importance of divine aid, and surely religion did often provide a sense of security to venturesome merchants. Finally, however, a purely material life did not seem sufficient. Godric began visiting saints' shrines with increasing frequency. He began to be disturbed by the high living, feasting, and drinking of some of his merchant colleagues. He also found that some of them stole outright. He attempted to correct them, but was rebuffed, ashamed of his own materialism, and possibly of some misdeeds of his own. He went on a pilgrimage to Rome. After that, with his parents' blessing, he decided to give himself entirely to a religious life. He sold all of his goods, gave the proceeds to the poor, and spent the rest of his life wandering as a religious hermit. Few Europeans lived lives as polarized as that of Godric, but many, particularly in growing cities, felt some tension between commercial change and religious commitment. Could someone interested in making money keep a primary devotion to God? Some, as Godric discovered, would choose commerce. Others opted for religion. Still, others worked for some combination. While few made Godric's dramatic ultimate choice, many merchants gave abundantly to the splendid churches of the cities, and not a few made deathbed renunciations of their commercial past. The post-classical period was a great age of faith in Western Europe, and Christianity provided the most obvious unifying factor of the new geography of Western European civilization. Christian missionary efforts led most Western Europeans to convert from polytheistic faiths to the initial post-classical centuries. In the initial post-classical centuries. But there were other key developments as well, including Europe's growing participation in trade and in wider interregional contacts. Not surprisingly, it was always easy, even for individuals, to put the pieces together. The post-classical period in Western Europe began with the fall of the Roman Empire and lasted until the 15th century. The period is known as the Middle Ages in European history. The adjective form is medieval. The period featured gradual recovery from the shock of Rome's collapse. At the same time, the forms of civilization spread northward, beyond the Roman orbit, covering the whole of Western Europe. Key characteristics of Western European civilization emerged from these dynamic processes. Medieval Western Europe participated in the network of expanding contacts among major societies in Asia, Europe, and parts of Africa. New tools introduced by invaders from Invasia, including a new kind of plow, helped spur medieval agriculture from the 10th century onward. New crops from Africa, including new varieties of wheat, increased food production. The revival of trade in the Mediterranean, bringing contacts with the Arabs, yielded other technological gains, such as the first European paper factory. Medieval culture was at least as powerfully shaped by connections with the wider world. By the 11th and 12th centuries, contact with the Byzantines and the Arabs had taught Western scholars new lessons in mathematics, science, and philosophy. The medieval West unquestionably took more from the emerging world network than it contributed, but it was also challenged by its interregional position to seek new world roles. Stages of post-classical development. From about 550 CE until about 900, Western Europe suffered from a number of problems. Rome continued to serve as the center of the growing Catholic Church, in turn the most powerful institution in the West. But Italy was divided politically. Spain, another key region of the Roman Empire in the West, lay in the hands of the Muslims through much of the Middle Ages. A vibrant intellectual and economic life was focused here, and would have an important influence on West European development later on. It was for the time being out of the Western mainstream. The center of the post-classical West lay in France, the Low Countries, and southern and western Germany, with England increasingly drawn in, areas where civilization as a form of human organization was new. Frequent invasions reflected and prolonged the West's weakness, making it develop durable government or economic forms. Raids by the seagoing Vikings from Scandinavia periodically disrupted life from Ireland to Sicily. With weak states and little more than subsistence agriculture, it was small wonder that intellectual activity declined. The few who could read and write were concentrated in hierarchy and the monasteries of the Catholic Church, where they kept learning alive. But they could do little more than copy older manuscripts, including those of the great Christian thinkers of the later Roman Empire. By their own admission, they could not understand much of the philosophy involved, and they could often apologize for their inability to write good Latin. Western Europe was still shaped by elements of the Roman heritage, but the connection was disrupted. The manorial system, obligations, and allegiances. Between Rome's fall and the 10th century, effective political organization was largely local. Although Germanic kings ruled some territories, such as the portion of which is France today, manorialism was the system of economic and political relations between landlords and their peasant laborers. Most people were serfs, living on self-sufficient agricultural estates called manors. Serfs were agricultural workers who received some protection, including the administration of justice from the landlords. In return, they were obligated to turn over part of their goods and to remain on the land. The manorial system had originated in the later Roman Empire. It was strengthened by the decline of the trade and the lack of larger political structures. Serfs needed the military forces the landlords could muster for their security. Without much market economy to simulate production and specialization, these same landlords used the serfs' produce and labor to support their own modest establishments. Life for most serfs was difficult. Agricultural equipment was limited and production was low. The available plows, copied from the Mediterranean models, were too light to work the heavy soils of France and Germany effectively. In the 9th century, a better plow, the moldboard, a curved iron blade, was introduced that allowed deeper turning of the soil. Most Western peasants early in the post-classical period also left half their land uncultivated each year to restore nutrients. This again limited productivity, although by the 9th century, a new 3-field system improved the situation. Here, only a third of the land was left unplanted each year to regain fertility. The obligations of the manorial system bore as heavily on most serfs as did the technological limitations. Serfs had to give their lord part of their crops in return for grazing their animals on his land, or milling their grain. They also provided many days of labor repairing the lord's castle or working the lands under his control. Serfs were not slaves. They could not be bought or sold, and they retained essential ownership of their houses and lands as long as they kept up with their obligations. They could also pass their property rights on through inheritance. Nevertheless, life remained hard, particularly in the early post-classical centuries. Some serfs escaped landlord control, creating a host of wanderers who added to the disorder of the early Middle Ages. The Church, political and spiritual power. During the centuries of recovery after the Roman Empire's collapse in the 6th century, the Catholic Church was the only extensive example of solid organization. Here was a crucial contrast with the state's dominance over religion in the Byzantine Empire. In theory, and to the extent in fact, the Church copied the government of the Roman Empire to administer Christendom. The Pope in Rome was the top authority. Regional churches were headed by bishops, who were supposed to owe allegiance to the Church's central authority. Bishops, in turn, appointed and to some degree supervised local priests. The popes did not always appoint the bishops, for monarchs and local lords often claimed this right, but they did send directives and receive information. The popes also regulated doctrine, beating back several heresies that threatened a unified Christian faith. Moreover, they sponsored extensive missionary activity. Papal missionaries converted the English to Christianity. They brought the religion to northern and eastern Germany, beyond the borders of the previous Roman Empire, and, by the 10th century, to Scandinavia. They were active in the border regions of Eastern Europe, sometimes competing directly with Orthodox missionaries. The interest of early Germanic kings in Christianity was a sign of the political as well as spiritual power of the Church. A warrior chieftain, Clavis, converted to Christianity about 496 CE to gain greater prestige over local rivals, who were still pagan. This authority, in turn, gave him a vague dominion over the Franks, a Germanic tribe located in much of what is France today. Conversion of this sort also strengthened beliefs by Western religious leaders, particularly the popes, that had a legitimate authority separate from the superior to the political sphere. As Figure 10.2 suggests, religious commitments continued to expand to many people. The Church also developed an important chain of monasteries during the centuries immediately after Rome's fall. Western monasteries helped discipline the intense spirituality felt by some individual Christians, people who wanted to devote themselves to prayer and religious discipline. I just read that twice. Sorry. Discipline and escape the limits of ordinary material life. The most important set of monastic rules was developed by Benedict of Nursia in Italy in the 6th century. The spread of Benedictine monasteries promoted Christian unity in Western Europe. Monasteries also served ordinary people as examples of a holy life, adding to the spiritual focus that formed part of the fabric of medieval society. Many monasteries helped improve the cultivation of the land at a time when agricultural techniques were at a low ebb. Ebb? It's spelled E-B-B. I've never seen that word before. Monasteries also provided some education and promoted literacy. Charlemagne, it's spelled Charlemagne. I'm going to pronounce it Charlemagne and his successors. One significant development occurred during the early post-classical centuries in the more strictly political sphere. The royal house of the Franks grew in strength during the 8th century. A new family, the Carolingians, took over this monarchy, which was based in northern France, Belgium, and western Germany. One founder of the Carolingian line, Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, was responsible for defeating the Muslims in the Battle of Tours in 732. Although his victory had more to do with the Arab exhaustion and an overextended invasion force Carolingian strength. This defeat helped define the Muslims to Spain and, along with the Byzantine defeat of the Arabs in the same period, preserved Europe for Christianity. A later Carolingian ruler in the same royal line, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, established a substantial empire in France and Germany around the year 800. See map 10.1. Briefly, it looked as if a new Roman Empire might revive in the West. Indeed, Charlemagne's successors in Germany continued to use the title of emperor. See figure 10.3. Charlemagne helped to restore some church-based education in Western Europe, and the level of intellectual activity began a slow recovery, in part because of these efforts. When Charlemagne it's pronounced Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died in 1814, however, this empire did not long survive him. Rather, it was split into 3 portions as inheritance for his 3 grandsons. The outlines of modern France, Germany, and a middle strip consisting of the Low Countries, Switzerland, and northern Italy. Map 10.1. Several of Charlemagne's successors, with nicknames such as the Bald and the Fat, were not great leaders even in the regional kingdoms. From this point onward, the essential political history of Western Europe consisted of the gradual emergence of regional monarchies. A durable empire provided impossible, given competing loyalties and the absence of a strong bureaucracy. When Western Europe proved to have strong cultural unity, initiality centered in Catholic Christianity, but with pronounced political divisions. No single language united the civilization any more than did a single government. Intellectuals and the church officials used Latin, but during the Middle Ages, separate spoken languages evolved, usually merging Germanic and Latin elements. These separate languages, such as French and English, in turn helped form the basis of halting national identities when political and cultural boundaries roughly coincided, which is what began to happen in key cases after the 9th century. The royal houses of several lands gained new visibility soon after Charlemagne's empire split. At first, the rulers who reigned over Germany and northern Italy were in the strongest position. It was they who claimed the title emperor, beginning around the 10th century. Later, they called themselves Holy Roman Emperors, merging Christian and classical claims. By this time, however, their rule had become increasingly hollow, precisely because they relied too much on their imperial claims and did not build a solid monarchy from regional foundations. Local lords often went their own way in Germany, and city-states showed independence in northern Italy. The future lay elsewhere, with the rise of monarchies and individual states that ultimately would become nations. New economic and urban vigor. By 900, a series of developments began to introduce new sources of strength into Western society that ultimately had clear political and cultural repercussions. New agricultural techniques developed from contacts with Eastern Europe and with Asian raiders into Central Europe. The new mold-board plow and the 3-field system were crucial gains. So was a new house collar that allowed horses to be yoked without choking. The use of horse collars and stirrups also confirmed the military dominance of the lords, who monopolized fighting on horseback. The European nobility became defined by land ownership and military power, but better plows helped the ordinary people by allowing deeper working of heavy soil and the opening of new land. Monasteries also promoted better agriculture methods, in contrast to less worldly orientation amongst in Eastern Europe. During the 10th century, Viking raids began to taper off, probably because regional governments became stronger sometimes when the Vikings themselves took over, as in the French province of Normandy, and partly because the Vikings, now Christianized, began to settle down. Greater regional political stability and improved agriculture promoted population growth, an important fact of Western history from the 10th through the 13th centuries. Population growth encouraged further economic innovation. More people created new markets. There was a wedge here for growing trade, which in turn encouraged towns to expand, another source of demand. Landlords and serfs alike began to look to lands that had not previously been converted to agriculture. Whole regions, such as northeastern Germany, became colonized by eager farmers, and new centers sprang up throughout settled regions such as France. To woo labor to the new farms, landlords typically had to loosen the bonds of serfdom and require less outright labor service, sometimes simply charging a monthly rent. Harsh serfdom still existed, but most serfs gained greater independence, and some free peasants emerged. Contacts with other countries brought knowledge of new crops, such as durum wheat from North Africa, the vital ingredient for pasta, and alfalfa from Persia. The peace of economic life created a less rigid social structure, and more commercial, market-oriented economic motives began to coexist with earlier military and Christian ideals. The growth of towns reflected the new vigor of Western Europe's agriculture. In parts of Italy and the Low Countries, where trade and urban manufacturing were especially brisk, urban populations soared to almost 20% of the total by the 13th century. Overall, the townspeople made up about 5% of the West population, a significant figure, though still below the often 15% levels of the advanced Asian civilizations. Few European cities approached a population level of 100,000 people. In contrast, China had 52 larger cities. But the rise of modest regional centers was an important development. Literacy spread to the urban atmosphere, spurring the population languages. Professional entertainers introduced new songs as well as dazzling tricks, such as fire eating and bear baiting. Urban interests spurred new forms of religious life, including city-based monastic orders dedicated to teaching or hospital work. Merchant activity and craft production expanded. Europe's economic and urban surge had helped feed formal cultural life, which had already gained somewhat under Charlemagne's encouragement. By the 9th and 10th centuries, schools began to form around important cathedrals, training children who were destined for church careers. By the 11th century, there was enough demand for educated personnel to sustain the first universities. Italy offered universities to train students in medicine and law. The legal faculties provided from a growing revival in knowledge of Roman law, and medicine benefited from new learning imported from the Arabs and from revived Greek and Hellenistic science. By the 12th century, a more characteristic university was forming in Paris. It specialized in training clergy and theology as the culminating subject, but with faculties in other subjects as well. The Parisian example inspired universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, Germany, and elsewhere. Solid educational institutions, though destined for only a small minority of Europe's population, supported increasingly diverse and sophisticated efforts in philosophy and theology. At the same time, medieval art and architecture reached a new high point, spurred by the same prosperity. Feudal monarchies and political advances. Prosperity also promoted political change, influenced by structures established in more unstable times. From the 6th century onward, the key political and military relationships in Western Europe had evolved in a system called feudalism. Feudal relationships linked military elites, most landlords who could afford the horses and iron weaponry necessary to fight. Greater lords provided protection and aid to lesser lords, called vassals. Vassals, in turn, owed their lords military service, some goods or payments and advice. Early feudalism, after Rome's fall, was very local. Many landlords had armed bands or 5 or 10 local vassals, easily converted into riding parties. But the feudal relationships could be extended to cover larger regions and even whole kingdoms. Charlemagne's empire boosted this more stable version of feudalism. He could not afford to pay his own bureaucracy, so he rewarded most of his military leaders with estates, which they quickly converted into family property in return for pledges of loyalty and service. Many German duchies were created by powerful lords and their own armies of vassals, ostensibly deferring to the Holy Roman Emperor. On the whole, European feudalism inhabited the development of strong central states, but it also gradually reduced purely local warfare. Furthermore, kings could use feudalism to build their own power. Kings of France began to win growing authority from the 10th century onward under the Captain royal family. At first, they had many serf-stocked manors directly, and then held most other local landlords as vassals. Most attentive administration of this regional base produced better revenues and armies. The kings also formed feudal links with great lords in other parts of France, often through marriage alliances, gradually bringing more territory under their control. They experimented with the beginnings of bureaucratic administration by separating their personal accounts from government accounts, thus developing a small degree of specialization among the officials who served them. Later, Capetian kings sent out officials to aid in regional administration. The growth of strong feudal monarchy in France took several centuries. By the early 14th century, the process of cautious centralization had gone so far in France that a king could claim rights to make the church pay taxes, an issue that caused great conflict. The king could mint money and employ some professional soldiers apart from the feudal armies that still did most of the fighting. Feudal monarchy in England was introduced more abruptly. The Duke of Normandy, of Viking descent, had already built a strong feudal domain in his French province, invaded England in 1066. The Duke, now known as William the Conqueror, extended his tight feudal system to his new kingdom. He tied the great lords of England to his royal court by bonds of loyalty, giving them estates in return for their military service. But he also used some royal officials, called sheriffs, to help supervise the administration of justice throughout the kingdom. In essence, he and his successors merged feudal principles with slightly more centralized approach, including more standardized national law codes issued by the royal court. The growth of feudal monarchy unknowingly duplicated measures taken early in other centralizing societies such as China, developing an explicit bureaucracy and some specialized functions, and sending emissaries to outlying provinces are examples. In Europe, kings often chose urban business or professional people to staff their fledgling bureaucracies, because unlike the feudal nobles, they could be loyal to the ruler who appointed them. Government functions extended modestly as kings tried to tax subjects directly and hire a small professional army to supplement feudal forces. Limited government. Stronger monarchies did not develop evenly throughout Europe. The West remained politically divided and diverse. Germany and Italy, though nominally controlled by the Holy Roman Emperor, were actually split into interregional states run by feudal lords and city-states. The Pope directly ruled the territory of central Italy. The Low Countries, a vigorous trade and manufacturing region, remained divided into regional units. Equally important were the limitations over the most successful feudal monarchies. The power of the Church continued to limit political claims, for the state was not supposed to intrude on matters of faith except in carrying out decisions of the popes or bishops. Feudalism created a second limitation for aristocrats still had a powerful independent voice and often their own military forces. The growth of the monarchy cut into aristocratic power, but this led to the new statements of the limits of kings. In 1215, the unpopular English King John faced the opposition of his taxation measures from an alliance of nobles, townspeople, and church officials. Defeated in his war with France and then forced down by the leading English lords, John was compelled to sign the Great Charter, or Magna Charter, which confirmed feudal rights against monarchical claims. John promised to observe restraint in his dealings with the nobles and the church agreeing, for example, not to institute new taxes without the Lord's permission, or to appoint bishops without the Church's permission. The Magna Charta showed how feudalism could generate claims of rights against the power of a king. Late in the 13th century, the same feudal balance led to the creation of parliaments as bodies representing not individual workers, but privileged groups such as the nobles and the church. Even earlier, in 1000, the regional kingdom of Catalonia created a parliament. The full English Parliament convened in 1265 with the House of Lords representing the nobles and the church hierarchy, and the Commons made up of elected representatives and wealthy citizens of the towns. As with the Magna Carta, the Parliament institutionalized the feudal principle that monarchs should consult with their vassals. In particular, parliaments gained the right to rule on any proposed changes in taxation through this power. They could also devise the crown on other policy issues. Although the parliament tradition became strongest in England, similar institutions arose in France, Scandinavia, Spain, and several other regional governments in Germany. Here, too, parliaments represented the key three estates: church, nobles, and urban leaders. They were not widely elected. Feudal limited government was not modern limited government. People had rights according to the estate into which they were born. Nobles transmitted membership in their estate to their children. There was no general concept of citizenship and certainly no democracy. Still, by creating the medieval version of representation institutions, Western feudal monarchy produced the beginnings of a distinctive political tradition. This tradition differed from the political results of Japanese feudalism, which emphasized group loyalty more than checks on central power. Even with feudal checks, European monarchs developed a capacity for more central administration during the later Middle Ages. See map 10.2. The results clearly are uneven and, by Asian standards, still woefully limited. European rulers also continue to see war as a key purpose. Local battles gave way to larger wars, such as the conflicts between the proud rulers of France and England. In the 14th century, a long battle began. In the 14th century, a long battle began. The Hundred Years' War began between the national monarchies of France and England over territories the English king controlled in France and over feudal rights versus the emerging claims of national states. The West's expansionist impulse. During the period of political development and economic advance, Western Europe began to show its muscle beyond its initial post-classical borders. Map 10.2. Population growth spurred the expansionist impulse, as did the memory of Rome's lost greatness and the righteous zeal provided by Pansianist impulse, as did the memory of Rome's lost greatness and I just reread the same line. I'm going to reread that sentence. Population growth spurred the expansionist impulse, as did the memory of Rome's lost greatness and the righteous zeal provided by Christianity. Germanic knights and agricultural settlers poured into sparsely settled areas in what is now eastern Germany and Poland, changing the population balance and clearing large areas of forest. A different kind of expansionist surge occurred in Spain. Some Christian states remained in the northern Spain by the 10th century, and they gradually began to attack the Muslim government that held most of the peninsula. The Reconquest escalated by the 11th century, as Christian forces swelled by feudal warriors from various areas pushed into central Spain, conquering the new Muslim center of Toledo. Full expulsion of Muslim rulers occurred only at the end of the Middle Ages in 1492, but the trend of the Christian offensive was clear even earlier. During the 15th century, regional Spanish monarchies fused through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, which provided the political muscle to complete the Christian Reconquista. At Europe's other extreme, Viking voyagers had pushed out into the northern Atlantic, establishing settlements in Iceland. By the 11th century, other voyages had pushed to Greenland and the Hudson Bay area in what is now Canada, where short-lived outposts were created. By the 13th century, Spanish and Italian seafarers entered the Atlantic from the Mediterranean without much initial result except several lost expeditions. The most dramatic expansionist move involved the Great Crusades against the Muslim control of the Holy Land. Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, appealing to the piety of the West rulers and common people. Crusaders were promised full forgiveness of sins if they died in battle, ensuring their entry to heaven, which obviously enhanced the religious motivations involved. The idea of attacking Islam had greater appeal. In Figure 10.4, as Figure 10.4 suggests, the attraction of winning spoils from the rich Arab lands added to the inducement, as did the thirst for excitement among the West's feudal warriors. Internal wars were declining in Europe, and military values of feudalism sought outlets elsewhere. Three great armies, with tens of thousands of crusaders from various parts of the West, assembled in Constantinople in 1097. Much of the distress of the Byzantine government, the Western Crusades moved from Jerusalem, winning it from the Turkish armies that held the area by that time. For a century, Western knights ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem, losing it to the great Muslim general Saladin during the 12th century. Several later crusades attempted to win back the Holy Land, but many later efforts turned toward other goals or toward pure farce. The Third Crusade at the end of the 12th century led to the death of the German emperor and imprisonment of the English king. although it did produce a brief truce with Saladin that facilitated Christian pilgrims' visits to Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade was manipulated by merchants in Venice, who turned it into an attack on their commercial rivals in Constantinople. The Crusades did not demonstrate a new warrior superiority in the wider world, despite brief success. In the Middle East, they generated only a passing episode, but in expressing a combination of religious zeal and growing commercial and military vigor on the part of the knights and merchants who organized the largest efforts, the Crusades unquestionably showed the aggressive spirit of the Western Middle Ages at their height. They also helped expose the West to new cultural and economic influences from the Middle East. This was a major spur to further change, including a greater thirst for goods, like spices, available only through international trade. Simply visiting the thriving urban center of Constantinople during the Crusades could open European eyes to new possibilities. One crusader exclaimed, "Oh, what a great and beautiful city is Constantinople! How many churches and palaces it contains, fashioned with wonderful skill. Their tradesmen at all times bring by boat all the necessities of man, religious reform and evolution." As medieval society developed, the Catholic Church went through several periods of decline and renewal. At times, the church officials and the leading monastic groups became preoccupied with their land holdings and their political interests. The church was a wealthy institution. It was tempting for many priests and monks to behave like ordinary feudal lords in pursuit of greater worldly power. Several reform movements fought this secularism, such as the 13th century flowering that created orders such as the Franciscans, devoted to poverty and service in Europe's bustling cities. Saint Clare of Assisi, 1194 to 1253, exemplified this new spirit of purity and dedication to the Church. Figure 10.5. She was deeply influenced by Saint Francis, also from Assisi. Yeah, that's how I'm going to say it. Also from Assisi, who converted to a life of piety and preached in 1205 and founded a new monastic order around him. Clare refused to marry as her parents wanted, but rather founded a women's Franciscan order, later known as the Order of St. Clare, or the Poor Clares. With Francis's backing, like many women in Europe, Clare found in monasticism a vital means of personal expression. In 1958, Pope Pius VII declared her the patron saint of television, for during her illness she miraculously heard and saw on the wall of her room a Christmas Mass being performed on the other side of Assisi. In addition to monastic leaders, reform-minded popes such as Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085, tried to purify the church and free it from interference by feudal lords. One technique was insistence on the particularly holy character of the priesthood. Reformers stipulated that all priests remain unmarried, to separate the priesthood from the ordinary world of the flesh. Gregory also tried to free the church from any trace of state control. He quarreled vigorously with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the practice of state appointment or investiture of bishops in Germany. Ultimately, by excommunicating the emperor from the church, Gregory won his point. The emperor appealed to the pope for forgiveness on his knees in the snow of a northern Italian winter, and the investiture controversy ended, apparently in the church's favor. Gregory and several other popes made it clear that their beliefs that the church not only was to be free from the state interference, but was superior to the state in its function as a direct channel of God's word. While governments still influenced religious affairs, a network of church courts developed to rule on matters of religious law and to bring heretics to trial and occasionally to execution. This was the origin of recurrent Western beliefs in church-state separation. The High Middle Ages. The post-classical version of Western civilization reached its high mark in the 12th and 13th centuries. Fed by the growing dynamism of Western Europe's population, agriculture, and cities, the High Middle Ages were characterized by a series of creative tensions. Feudal political structures, derived from local and personal allegiances, were balanced by emerging central monarchies. The unquestionable authority of the Church and cultural dominance of Christianity jostled the intellectual vitality and diversity that formed part of university life. A social order and economy based primarily on agriculture and the labor of serfs had now come to terms with important cities, merchants, and some new opportunities even for ordinary farmers. Western culture in the post-classical period. During the centuries before about 1000, a small number of clergy continued the efforts of preserving and interpreting past wisdom, particularly the writings of church fathers such as Augustine, but also the work of some non-Christian Latin authors. During Charlemagne's time, a favorite practice was to gather quotations from ancient writers around key subjects. Interest in classical principles of rhetoric, particularly logic, reflected the concern for coherent organization. Aristotle, known to the Middle Ages as the philosopher, was valued because of his clear exposition of rational thought. Theology, assimilating faith and reason. From 1000 onward, a series of outstanding clerics advanced the logical exposition of philosophy and theology to new levels. They stressed the importance of absolute faith in God's word, but they believed that human reason could not move toward an understanding of some aspects of religion and the natural order as well. Thus, according to several theologians, it was possible to prove the existence of God. Fascination with logic led some intellectuals to certain zeal in pointing out inconsistencies in past wisdom, even in the writings of the Church Fathers. In the 12th century, Peter Abelard in Paris wrote a treatise called Yes and No, in which he showed several logical contradictions in establishing interpretations of doctrine. Although Abelard protested his faith, saying, "I would not be an Aristotle if this were to be part of me from Christ," he clearly took an impish delight to suggesting skepticism. Here was a fascinating case of an individual's role in history. Abelard was clearly working in an established logical tradition, but his personality helped move the tradition to a new critical level. At the same time, his defiant attitudes may have drawn more attack than a softer approach would have done, which had consequences too. The logical rationalist current in Western philosophy was hardly unopposed. A powerful monk, Bernard of Clairvaux, successfully challenged Abelard. Bernard, an intellectual of a different sort, stressed the importance of mystical union with God, unobtainable even on this earth in brief, blissful glimpses, rather than rationalist endeavor. Bernard believed that reason was dangerous and that God's truth must be received through faith alone. The debates over how and whether to combine the classical Mediterranean philosophical and scientific tradition with revealed religious faith reflected the earlier debates among Arab intellectuals during the 10th and 11th centuries. Both Christianity and Islam relied heavily on faith in a revealed word, through the Bible or Quran, respectively. But some intellectuals in both cultures strained to include other approaches. Combining rational philosophy and Christian faith was the dominant intellectual theme in the post-classical West, showing the need to come to terms with both Christian and classical heritages, and with Middle Eastern learning as well. This combination of rational philosophy and Christian faith also posed formidable and fascinating problems. By the 12th century, the zeal for this kind of knowledge, produced several distinctive results. It explains the intellectual vitality of most of the emerging universities, where students flock to hear the latest debates by leading theologians. Higher education certainly benefited students throughout resulting job opportunities. For example, trained lawyers could hope for advancement in the growing bureaucracies of church or state. In contrast to China's institutions, however, the new universities were not directly tied to a single bureaucratic system, and the excitement they engendered during the Middle Ages was not just opportunistic. A large number of students from the whole of Western Europe sought out the mixture of spiritual and rational understanding that leading thinkers were trying to work out. The post-classical intellectual drive also motivated a growing interest in knowledge newly imported from the classical past and from the Arab world, and this knowledge fed the highest achievements of medieval learning. By the 12th century, Western scholars were reading vast amounts of material translated from Greek in centers of the Byzantine Empire, Italy, and Muslim Spain. They gained familiarity with the bulk of ancient Greek and Hellenistic philosophy and science. They also read translations of Arab and Jewish learning, particularly the works in which Middle Eastern scholars had wrestled with the problems of mixing human reasoning with truths gained by faith. With much fuller knowledge of Aristotelian and Hellenistic science, plus the work of Arab rationalists such as Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. Western philosopher-theologians in the 13th century proceeded to the final great synthesis of medieval learning. The leading figure was Thomas Aquinas, the Italian-born monk who taught at the University of Paris. Aquinas maintained the basic belief that faith came first, but he greatly expanded the scope given to reason. Through reason alone, humans could know much of the natural order, moral law, and the nature of God. Aquinas had complete confidence that all essential knowledge could be organized coherently, and he produced a host of summas, or highest works, that used careful logic to eliminate all possible objections to truth as revealed by reason and faith. Essentially, this work restated in Christian terms the Greek efforts to seek a rationality in nature that would correspond to the rational capacities of human mind. To be sure, a few philosophers carried the interest in logic to absurd degrees. After the 13th century, scholasticism, as the dominant medieval philosophical approach, was called because of its base in the schools, sometimes degenerated into silly debates such as the one about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. But at its height, and particularly with Aquinas, scholasticism demonstrated an unusual confidence in the logic orderliness of knowledge and in human ability to know. Medieval philosophy did not encourage a great deal of scientific work. The emphasis on mastering past learning and organizing it logically could lead to overemphasis on previous discoveries rather than empirical research. Thus, university-trained doctors stressed memorization of Galen, the Hellenistic authority, rather than systematic practical experience. Toward the end of the 13th century, a current of practical science developed. In Oxford, members of the clergy, such as Roger Bacon, did experimental work with optics, pursuing research done earlier by Muslim scholars. An important byproduct of this interest was the invention of eyeglasses. During the 14th and 15th centuries, experimenters also advanced knowledge in chemistry and astronomy. This work set the stage for the flourishing of Western science.